This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. Today is actually the 30th of December 2014, so it will be the last program for 2014. And I thought it might be interesting to take a look at some of the women who have been featured on stamps. But before I do that, I want to talk about some January birthdays, because by the time this program airs, it'll probably be just about January 1st, 2015. The first person that I'm going to mention is actually someone who is on one of my stamps. Incidentally, you know how small stamps are, and so of course these pictures aren't going to be very large, and especially if they are one of a group, if they are one of in a group of women, as this woman is. Her name is Lucretia Mott, and she was born in the 18th century, actually, but she was active during the 19th century. She was a Quaker lady, and she was one of the people who was involved with the Seneca Falls Conference, if you could call it that was held in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And Lucretia Mott got there because she had met a woman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in 1840, when both of them had gone to London to an anti-slavery conference. Actually, they were both delegates from their groups in the United States. But in Britain at the time, they would not seat the women as delegates, and in fact, they sort of were exiled upstairs to the balcony. And so Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had a chance to do a lot of talking when probably downstairs before the days of electronic machines which make your voice so much louder. They possibly couldn't hear much of what was going on at the conference anyway. But they were both very concerned about women's rights, and especially the right to vote. So they decided that sometime they'd get together and have a meeting about women's rights. And that didn't actually occur for 8 more years, when Lucretia Mott happened to be visiting near Seneca Falls, New York, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton was living at the time. And then they set up this famous conference. Women came from all over that part of upper New York State. You know, this was not New York City. Actually, the nearest large city was Rochester, New York. And a lot of people came. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote up the Declaration of Sentiments and included the right to vote as one of the rights that women should have. And that was a very revolutionary concept at the time. The stamp to which I'm referring, and which we will see in the next clip, shows Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott on both ends of a group of 3. And the third person happens to be the woman who actually saw voting come to women in 1920. And that was Carrie Chapman Catt. So this picture, the purple one, if you see one that's kind of a purple one there, that shows the one with the 3 women, including Lucretia Mott, the 18th century woman who promoted women's rights. Let's see, now we'll go back to some other people in the January birthday set. Here we have the 5th of January. That is the birthday of Olympia Brown, who was born in Michigan in 1835. And she went to college and became a minister. In fact, she was the first credited woman minister in the United States. I believe she was a Universalist minister at one time. She lived to be quite an elderly lady, and I think maybe she even lived long enough to be able to vote herself. I'm not absolutely sure of that, but I think that that's a possibility, since she was born in 1835 and had quite a long life, and women got the vote nationally in the year 1920. Olympia Brown, January 5th. On the 6th, there was a woman who was a famous muckraker. And what they meant by muckraker back in the time of President Theodore Roosevelt was people who were writing, journalists for the most part, and people who wrote for magazines, and who exposed problems, especially government problems or problems with big business and so on. Ida Tarbell from Pennsylvania was the most famous of the women muckrakers of the era about, during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, which would have been during, say, 1905, 1906, and so on. And the person that Ida Tarbell took after most famously was John D. Rockefeller, the famous Ohioan who founded Standard Oil. And over the years, he bought up, bought out, squeezed out, whatever, small oil companies to make his gigantic company called Standard Oil. And it got to be such a big company that finally the government took out after it, and Standard Oil was broken up into 5 separate companies. But since then, some of those companies have gotten back together again. For instance, Standard Oil of New Jersey was called Esso later on, and it gobbled up eventually Saucony Vacuum Oil, which was Standard Oil of New York, which was the oil company I worked for as a new graduate just out of Stanford in 1951. And Saucony Vacuum Oil eventually became a part of Esso, which is now called Exxon. So they actually got back together, but Ida Tarbell was very much part of the effort that broke up the big, gigantic Standard Oil in the first time in about 1911. January 7th is the birthday of Zora Neale Hurston. I don't have a stamp for her, although I think there may have been a stamp that came out for Zora Neale Hurston fairly recently in the Black Heritage series, because she was a famous Negro author. And in the middle 1930s, she wrote a book called Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a very interesting book about a black community in Florida, similar to the one in which Zora Neale Hurston herself grew up. It was a totally black community, and there wasn't any particular problem with the fact of Jim Crow laws and so forth, since there weren't any whites in the community to look down their noses at the blacks in the first place. So anyway, Zora Neale Hurston worked her way through college and went to New York City in the 1920s and became involved in the Harlem Renaissance. And as I mentioned, was an author herself, a well-known author herself. Tragically, later, In fact, they explain here in the book that Remember the Ladies by Kirsten Olson, that she managed to alienate all sorts of people, both white and black, partly because she was such a strong woman with strong views. Leftists were against her because she had a lot of conservative views, actually, and conservatives were against her because she was a so-called uppity type woman in the first place. But what happened eventually was that she was no longer able really to write the good things that she had written in the 20s and 30s, and she went back to being a maid and working for very minimum wage. And when she died in about 1960, she was buried in an unmarked grave. She is someone who has come back to popularity and to human interest, especially in the women's movement, because of the writings that she did in the 1920s and 30s. Zora Neale Hurston, who was born, well, they say probably in 1901. I guess they weren't absolutely even sure just when she was born. Let's see who else we have here that early January might be of interest. Well, here's a woman who was a professional baseball player in the 1920s. Her name was Jackie Mitchell. And I'll bet you haven't heard of her, but you should have, because there aren't very many women at all who were ever professional baseball players. All the other people on her team, of course, were men. And Simone de Beauvoir, the French feminist, was born on January 9th in Paris in the year 1908. She has written quite a famous book about women, which came out in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And she was a famous French intellectual of her day. Finally, I'm going to mention Alice Paul, January 11th. And you know, I think this is the first time I really realized that Alice Paul, the famous suffragette, she came late to the program, you know, long after the deaths of people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was active 1911, 12, 13, and during the First World War first as quite a young woman. She had learned, she was an American, but she had learned her female activism while she was living in England. And she came back, and one of the things she did was to organize a parade that was held for women's rights with thousands of people participating. It was actually held on the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. So that would have been March 3rd, 1914, since in those days the presidents were inaugurated on March 4th. And Alice Paul lived a long life. She was still protesting and marching in parades for women and for human rights activities in the 1970s. Alice Paul was also the person who for decades, from the 1920s, well, for 50 years actually, she was promoting the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, which unfortunately has never made it into the Constitution. But it was before the states for many years, from 1973 to 1983. It was before the states, and it got up to, I believe, 36 ratified states, but that was too short of what is needed, which is 38 states. And so the Equal Rights Amendment never became a part of the Constitution. However, it's regularly introduced into Congress, and it really would be wonderful if someone would if some people, if some groups, if some movement were to resurrect the Equal Rights Amendment and make it a part of the Constitution. All it says is equality of rights shall not be denied by the United States or by any state on account of sex. 23 simple words, which was never able to make it to the Constitution. And the interesting thing about her birthday that I was just reminded of was the fact that January 11th, when she was born, was also the birthday of my late mother, who was a political activist and who served in the Nevada legislature when I was a very little girl. I don't really personally remember the time because I was only 4 when she served in the Nevada legislature. Lois Hatch Dymel Washburn, Lois Washburn, my beloved mother, and she's been gone now for 55 years because she died the same year that my oldest son, Richard William Whaley, was born. Well, those are some January birthdays to get us started. And now I'm going to talk about women involved with some of these stamps here. So if we can have the picture of the first group of stamps again. I'm not sure that Matt is still here. I think he's probably busy doing some other things. Oh, there he is. Hi, Matt. Thanks. Can you show that first group of stamps again? Yes, okay. There we have it. Well, that red one up in the corner, that is for Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross is famous. She's not in Remember the Ladies, but she's remembered by all the patriotic people as being the woman who sewed the first American flag, you know, the stars and stripes with the red and white stripes for the 13 original colonies that became the original states. And so that flag, I think, was first flown in 1776. The next group over is quite small stamps. In fact, unusually small. I don't think I've ever seen any as small as that. But that is a 15-cent stamp, and it shows Dolly Madison. Dolly Madison was the wife of President James Madison, who was the president during the War of 1812. And probably she is most famous for the fact that when the British were threatening Washington, D.C., and actually they did capture Washington, D.C., and burned it, she escaped from the White House. They burned the White House too, you know. She escaped from the White House with a portrait of George Washington, which was already, you know, famous portrait of the first president, was in the White House, and she took it with her, rolled it up and took it with her so that it was not burned up. There's a famous joke, you know, about an Englishman who, when someone said to him, you know, indignantly, well, you know, during the War of 1812, the British burned Washington. And this man said, obviously his history was a little shaky. He said, burned Washington? He said, I knew we burned Joan of Arc, but surely we didn't burn Washington. But of course, the Washington that got burned was D.C., and after the War of 1812, of course, it was rebuilt, and the White House was, I think the walls were still standing and so on, was refurbished again. The next person here is Dorothea Dix, and she was one of a number of women who was involved during the 19th century, trying to get a better deal for people who were mistreated in prisons and in lunatic asylums. In fact, there weren't any lunatic asylums per se about the time that Dorothea Dix was active during the 19th century, and that was one of her concerns and one of the things that she advocated for. The next picture, that purple one you see in the corner, is the one that I mentioned earlier, which shows Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the women who set up the Seneca Falls Convention in July of 1848. And then in the center, the picture of Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the person who took over essentially pretty much after the death of Susan B. Anthony in 1906, and saw through to the women getting the right to vote in 1920, upon which time she founded the League of Women Voters, which is still very active and doing excellent work in letting folks know about the upcoming elections. Next to that, I have just a little stamp here that shows Susan B. Anthony, and there was a 3-cent stamp of Susan B. Anthony which came out in the 1930s, but I think this is a more special one because it shows 50 cent. This is a 50-cent denomination stamp. So not too sure when that came out. And then that's the little one, and then next to it is 4. You notice most of these stamps are groups of 4 because that's what stamp collectors look for is groups of 4 for the most part. Sometimes they are even the ones that have like a little number in the corner. Many of the ones like the Dolly Madison stamp and the Betsy Ross stamp and the stamp showing the 3 suffragette leaders, and this one, this red one down in the corner, have a number, and often there was only one number on a whole sheet of 100 stamps, and so if you had that corner which had the number on it, that was an especially important one to be able to collect. Well, the woman that's shown there is Julia Ward Howe. Julia Ward Howe, in this picture, shows her as a very handsome young woman. Many of the pictures of her show her in her old age, but this is Julia Ward Howe as a young woman, which she was at the time that she wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic in 1862 during the American Civil War, which was probably the most famous song to come out of the American Civil War. Battle Hymn of the Republic by Julia Ward Howe. Now, these stamps are roughly in chronological order. And so let's see the next set of stamps, Matt, if we can. Right. Yeah, okay. I think the first one here, I'm not sure. I think that maybe it got out a little bit out of order. But let's look at the 2. These are sideways stamps. They are 17s if you have a large enough TV to show it on the screen. And it shows 2, which are not up and down stamps, not vertical stamps, but are horizontal. And this stamp is not of a real live person, but of a very famous American woman, namely the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. It was a 17-cent airmail stamp at one point. I'm not sure when that would be. That's, you know, we haven't had special airmail stamps for decades now, but this was a 17-cent airmail, and it shows the Statue of Liberty. The face, you know, with her famous crown sort of thing, which is so big that people can go up inside the statue and look out those windows, which they really are, which form the crown of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. And because of speaking chronologically, if we consider that Julia Ward Howe first came to prominence in the American Civil War during the 1860s, then the Statue of Liberty dates from 1876. It was a gift of the French government to the American government in 1876, the first centennial of the American Revolution. And that was because the French were on the side of the colonials, obviously, during the American Revolution. They were the traditional enemies of the British in those days, and so they were willing to help the American colonies. Ben Franklin went over there and helped talk them into it. And Lafayette came as a very young man. The Marquis de Lafayette came to the U.S. and served on the staff of General George Washington during the American Revolution. And many years later, he came back actually for the 50th anniversary in 1826. He came back to the United States, and he took a trip down the Ohio River, stopping in Marietta itself. So the French have been allies of the United States for a very long time, and they were the ones who sent over the Statue of Liberty. 1971? Oh, okay. Matt has checked for me, and apparently this 17-cent airmail stamp showing the Statue of Liberty dates from 1971. And you know, I remember actually that there was all this great fanfare leading up to 1976. And so I'm not at all surprised that it came out in 1971. We had a lot of stamps commemorating battles of the American Revolution and so on. Although you would think those would have come later on the bicentennial of some of those famous battles and so on. But I'm not a bit surprised, because there were many commemorative stamps leading up to the bicentennial of the American Revolution in the 1970s. Well, then next to the, well, I'm sort of going backwards here. You can't see it that closely anyway, I'm afraid. Let's see. Beside we have an American poet from the 19th century, Emily Dickinson. That sort of light green stamp that's up in the corner there shows Emily Dickinson, who they say wrote maybe as many as 2,000 poems, most of them rather short poems. She was not a noted poet in her day. She wrote poems, she stuffed them in her bureau drawers, and I don't know that any of them were actually published in her own lifetime. But her sister-in-law and brother were instrumental in saving those poems and sending them out and having them published, and now she's probably the most famous of all the American women poets, Emily Dickinson. Then there's a little sort of a turquoise-colored stamp next to Emily Dickinson, and that's a 17-cent stamp, which may have also come out, I'm not sure exactly when it came out either, but anyway, it shows Belva Lockwood, who was active in the latter part of the 19th century. She was one of the first women lawyers, in the United States, and she even put her hat in the ring to run for president, I think in the 1880s. But Belva Lockwood, and her stamp may have come out during one of those March Women's History Month times that we started celebrating in the 1970s. Then there's a little purple stamp, and that little purple stamp is Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt, the famous American woman artist who was the only woman who was really considered one of the French Impressionists. She was a contemporary with people like Renoir, and she was from Pennsylvania. She went to study art in Paris, and she stayed there for many a long year. Mary Cassatt. In fact, I think that Remember the Ladies tells about how she came back to Pennsylvania to visit her brother or something, and the article that appeared in the newspaper said something along the line of she had a little dog who was a very nice little pet or something like that. Didn't mention the fact that she was a famous artist in France at all. One of my own personal connections with Mary Cassatt is that she was one of the descendants of the huge Dubois family, Dubois, and so am I. And of course, a much different generation. By now, there are thousands of us because the Dubois family that came to the Hudson River in 1660s, Catherine Dubois, Mrs. Louis Dubois, had something like 7 sons, and I'm a descendant of the 5th son, who was called Solomon. I'm not sure which one Mary Cassatt was related to, but there were something like 7 Dubois boys who fanned out across the eastern United States in the late 17th century and the 18th century. And there is a little town in Pennsylvania actually called Dubois, or Dubois, and there are a number of other towns called Dubois around the United States, probably significant to how many of those Dubois went to different spots in the United States. Mary Cassatt, the famous American woman who was a member of the French Impressionist group in the late 19th, early 20th century. Okay, I think that's all the ones that are on that slide. So perhaps we can see the next one, Matt. All right. Once again, I'm a little puzzled. I set these things out myself. I shouldn't be a bit puzzled, but somehow I am. Well, let's see. Right, I think the one in the upper corner there is shows a woman who was active in the, well, as a matter of fact, she was not only active, she was a spy. She was an American who was a nurse who was a spy during World War I. And the Germans, when they realized that she was sending messages to the British, executed her. Her name was Clara Moss. Then the next group, we see 4 horizontal red stamps, and that is also associated with World War I because it shows a picture of the woman on the stamp is Moira Michael, and she was the founder of the Memorial Poppy They have a picture of the flower, the poppies there. And it's red because the memorial poppies that you see on Memorial Day are red for the poppies of France and Europe, where the wild poppies are a red color, unlike the orange poppies that grow in our country in California, that grow wild there. The European poppies are red, and the memorial poppy comes out for people to remember the veterans of World War I and later World War II who fought in Europe during those two world wars of the 20th century. And Moira Michael was the founder. I don't know the story beyond that, but like many people, I've often worn the Memorial Day poppy on Memorial Day. The next pictures show, well, maybe it's the other way back anyway. I'm having a bit of a problem here identifying them myself. So let's talk about some that I do know. Those purple ones that are on the left there and are the horizontal stamps. Those are 5-cent stamps dating from the 1960s, and they were to commemorate Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was the only president I had ever heard of until I was 12 years old, because he was first elected in 1932, the year that I was born, and he died late in World War II in April of 1945. And I think I've told you before about how we suddenly were called to an assembly in April of 45 at my school in Nevada, and it turned out that the president had died, which was a great shock to everyone, although he had not been looking very well for a while. He had, even during the election in 1944, people could see he was looking older than his years might indicate, because he was born in 1882, which meant that he was not a really old man in 1945. He was in his 60s, not really old, when he suddenly passed away from a stroke down in Warm Springs, Georgia, where he frequently went because of his lameness from having had polio when he was an adult man, father of 6 children and so on, and had run to be Vice President of the United States in 1920 when he was struck with polio in 1922. So he died in Warm Springs, Georgia, where he often went to enjoy the waters and feel better during swimming, and where many other people who had had polio were able to go and also be treated at Warm Springs. And then we also see a picture there of a woman associated with Franklin Roosevelt's time in office. That is Frances Perkins. Now, it's interesting to me that Kirsten Olson does not include Frances Perkins in Remember the Ladies, because Frances Perkins was the first woman to serve in a U.S. president's cabinet. She was Secretary of Labor all during the Roosevelt administration from 1933 to 1945. She was Secretary of Labor. She was from New York State, where President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt lived. And she was someone that had been well known to them as activists speaking for labor. And so she became the Secretary of Labor, and that was a new cabinet post, actually, hadn't been around very long, and she was that Secretary of Labor in the cabinet of Franklin Roosevelt for 12 years. Next to her, which is, she has that sort of turquoise colored stamp, which is a 15 center, incidentally. And next to her, there's a little orange stamp, sort of a standard size stamp, which shows an American author, quite well known, and someone who was from West Virginia, in that she was born there, but she's more associated, I think, probably, with China, because that is Pearl Buck, and she wrote a number of books and a number of magazine articles and so on, which featured China. Her parents had been missionaries in China. She was born in West Virginia, as I say, but she really was raised in China and lived there for a long time. Married someone, an American from, while she was still in China, I believe, and then wrote these famous books, including The Good Earth. There's an interesting connection with today's news in that they are speaking on the radio today. I heard them talking about the European actress Louisa Rainier. And Louisa Rainier was the person who played the woman lead in The Good Earth. Back in the 1930s, when that film was made, they didn't always follow, you know, blacks being real blacks and Chinese being real Chinese. Often there were white people who were took these roles, and Louise Rainier even won an Oscar as Best Actress for her role in Pearl Buck's movie called The Good Earth. So some of these things, you know, have connections not only with old times, but also with modern times. So there is Pearl Buck. Now somehow I think I missed a couple here. Can we see the next slide? What is the next slide, Matt? Yeah, I think we did miss a couple. So I think I'll, if you just go back to the regular parts right now, Matt, just show me again. That's good. Okay. I'll mention a couple of others that we missed somehow or other. One is Emily Bissell, and this is a 15-cent stamp from probably the 60s or 70s. But it commemorates a woman who was active in founding the Tuberculosis Association. So the stamp features the cross with the two bars on it, which is the symbol of the American Lung Association, since she was so involved with setting up the American Lung Association and working against tuberculosis, which was a terrible scourge earlier. Nowadays, tuberculosis is rarer than it once was, and they have vaccination against tuberculosis now, but they didn't in the old days. And I remember, for instance, the mother of one of the students that I had in when I first taught in northern Nevada in 1952-53 on the Indian reservation. One of the mothers, in fact, the mother of one of the, I think there were 2 children who were not Indian children in that class of about 20 that I had. They were both children of people who worked for the Indian Bureau on the reservation. So this was a white woman, but tuberculosis had been a terrible scourge, especially among the Indians, partly, I think, because at least in that day, small houses, big beds with a number of children sleeping together and so on. And the problem was often that a child who contracted tuberculosis would be sent away to a tuberculosis hospital and never return. You know, they often did not go until they were till the disease had such a bad hold on them that they actually died at the hospital. And I know I had several children, Indian children in this case, in my class who had older siblings who had died in the hospital where they had gone to be treated for tuberculosis. But actually, like I say, Douglas was the child of someone who worked for the Indian Service, and his mother had had tuberculosis and had spent a year in a hospital when she was a young woman, but she luckily was treated soon enough and recovered and, you know, became his mom. But tuberculosis was a tremendous scourge. So we have to be grateful to Emily Bissell and the work that she did with the American Lung Association. And let's see, another one that got missed somehow was Edith Wharton. Again, this is a 15-cent stamp like the Bissell and the Frances Perkins, coming out probably in the 1960s, late in the 60s or in the 70s. But it shows the American woman author Edith Wharton. Edith Wharton wrote a number of books in the early 20th century especially, and she was sort of a novelist of manners, you know, one of those women who wrote about families and their problems and their ins and outs, and often society people, you know, not just ordinary citizens. But Edith Wharton is well known for her novels that she wrote in the early 20th century. And let's see, here's another 15-cent stamp one that I haven't talked about yet. This is interesting. It has 2 women on it, or perhaps females is a better term. But it shows a relatively young woman, and she is holding the hand of a girl who's, I would say, you know, maybe 11 or 12 in this picture. And both names are on the stamp because it is for Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. Helen Keller, as a child of about 2 years old, had terrible sickness, which left her blind and deaf. But she had started to talk and walk and all that sort of thing before she got sick. However, after her sickness, she was blind and deaf, and she was dumb also. She could not speak because, well, she was just cut off from the world, and there was nothing much that she could do. But she finally got a very talented teacher named Anne Sullivan, And Anne Sullivan had actually been a student in New England of Samuel Gridley Howe, the husband of Julia Ward Howe. Samuel Gridley Howe was the person in charge of a well-known school that trained teachers to work with the people who were blind or deaf, or maybe both. And so she had had that training before she went down to Alabama to live with the Keller household. And the story of her successful effort to teach Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf and had been dumb, to talk and to be able to communicate with people, teaching her Braille eventually. But that story is told in The Miracle Worker, which was a famous movie. I think it was first a play on Broadway, perhaps, but it tells the story of how she finally got through to this child who could neither see nor hear, and was able eventually to teach her to speak and to read. Helen Keller became a well-known philanthropist. She spoke out very clearly all of her life for poor people who could not communicate as well as many of us can, hopefully. Helen Keller, I remember she was still alive when I was a young girl, and one would hear stories from time to time of things that she had been doing in her philanthropy work. So that is, I think maybe that's all the stamps except the very last one. So could we now see the last stamps? Right. Well, the purple one, which is a horizontal stamp, and it shows a woman, a mother, with a girl, a little daughter, and that stamp is a generic stamp. It's not someone specific. It says the American Woman, and this is a 4-cent stamp. It came out in the 1960s when 4-cent stamps came out. And, you know, celebrates American women, which is a nice thing, you know, to have us celebrated as women. Now, the other stamp that is shown there is of the most modern woman that I have some of these sets of 4-cent stamps on. This was a famous athlete, and her name was Babe Zacharias. She was well known as a golfer, especially. She is shown on the stamp holding her trophy for being the most outstanding woman golfer of her day. She was, I must admit, I don't know enough about the Olympics to know for sure whether golf was an Olympic sport at the time that Babe Zacharias was active, but she certainly was well known in her day, not only for golfing but for other sports, and she served as a real role model for women who were interested in sports. So we've had quite a variety of women here today on our stamps, all the way from Betsy Ross way back in 1776 to Babe Zacharias, who was a national champion for women's golf in the 1950s. And in between, various poets, Oh, here's one other one that I didn't mention and that I'm going to do much more on one of these days, and that is Edna St. Vincent Millay, one of my favorite poets. I have just received some information from the place where she lived in New York State that is now becoming a tourist location. It's north of New York City, sort of in the quiet part of New York State, near the Connecticut border. And so I'll be telling you more about Edna St. Vincent Millay at that time. So we're down to our last minute or so here, and I want to wish everyone a Happy New Year. This program being done on December 30th, and tomorrow's New Year's Eve, and then we'll be celebrating at midnight on December 31st, New Year's Eve. We'll be celebrating the coming of the new year, 2015. And I do wish one and all of you a very happy new year. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.